Friends, Dave Paulides, CanAm Missing Project, copyrighted edition for our video channel. Huck just came out from a big long walk in the woods. Took a big drink of water. Yeah, was that fun? Was that fun? Yeah, that was fun. She's doing good. It's about 80 degrees out. She's cut short so she doesn't get too heated, but she still gets pretty hot back there. Yeah, you're a good girl. Yeah, you're a good girl. All right, come on, let's go. So she made her appearance. The executive producer is now gone. Huck TV is on the air. Yes, Huck TV. So I have a super interesting segment for you. I'm going to guess some people are going to hate it and some people are going to love it. So before I get started, a person sent me something pretty interesting. Never heard of this, but I want to read it to you. Hey Dave, enclosed please find a spirit lodge, which I made in honor of Ben. It's a box, a sealed box. Here's the design on the other side. It says, in many Native American tribes and Canadian First Nations, one meeting for a spirit lodge is a small symbolic house which spirits of warriors and other family members can use as a focal point on Earth's plane, if they so desire. It is not an idol or anything like that. Many tribes put these outside on a pole which supports it. However, the materials which I used would not survive Montana winters. With freezing, thawing, refreezing, snow load, etc. So I recommend that you determine an appropriate place to keep it in your home. It doesn't have to be a prominent place, and it doesn't have to be readily visible to visitors. You are the best one to decide where it goes. There are no holes in a spirit lodge, and spirits do not need a door for entry and exit. I took the liberty of making the shade of red I used for the University of Miami of Ohio men's hockey team stick somewhat different than the one in the actual school colors. Although I am psychic, I do not claim to be a medium or a channeler. However, I seem to know what Ben wants and would have wanted on the spirit lodge I made in his honor. No, he did not talk to me or anything like that, just somehow I knew what was to portray positions and colors. The planet Mars, astrologically, is supposed to have greatly influenced athletes. It is also highly symbolic. The illustration on the spirit lodge was deliberately somewhat cartoonish in this case, because that was what was appropriate. They make it look more rustic. This is the first spirit lodge I've ever made. Paul. Well, thanks, Paul. That was very thoughtful of you. Very thoughtful. And I'll put that somewhere. Thank you. I think about Ben every day. And at times I can really feel him around me. Times I can't. But I hope he's around. Now today's a little different. You know that I've talked about chronic wasting disease, a prion disease that has attacked cervids in North America, Canada, and the US. And it's decimating wildlife right now. No one's really doing anything about it. And that's just the facts. Well, one of you forwarded me this article. I'm going to read it to you because I'm in the outdoors all the time. I know many of you are. And I like mysteries. I don't like the outcome of this mystery, but it is a true mystery. Before I get into this article, go grab yourself a hot cocoa, coffee, put your feet up. If you're eating an almond croissant, don't tell me. I'll be jealous. But relax. Put it on pause. And then we'll get into this article and a missing persons case. Now, I rarely read articles. But this one, I read it 3 times. It really, it's a mind boggler. Title is They All Got Mysterious Brain Diseases. They're Fighting to Learn Why. DNYUZ.com. In late 2018, after an otherwise normal Christmas holiday, Lori Beatty started acting strange. An 81-year-old retired contractor, he grew unnaturally quiet and began poring over old accounting logs from a construction business he sold decades earlier, convinced that he had been bilked out of the deal. Over the course of several days, Beatty slipped further into unreality. He told his wife the year was 1992 and wondered aloud why his hair had turned so white. Then he started having seizures. His arms began to move uncontrollable jerks and twitches. By the end of May, he was dead. Doctors at the Georges L. Dumont University Hospital Center in Moncton, the largest city in the province of New Brunswick, Canada, zeroed in on an exceedingly rare condition, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, caused by prions, misfolding proteins in the brain, as the most likely culprit. Doctors explained this to Beatty's children, Tim and Jill, and said they would run additional tests to confirm the post-mortem diagnosis. 3 months later, when the siblings returned to the office of their father's neurologist, Dr. Alier Marrero, that's what they were expecting to hear. Instead, Marrero told them that Lori's Jakob test had come back negative. We were all looking at one another, Tim says, because we were all very confused. If Creutzfeldt-Jakob hadn't killed their father, then what had? What Marrero said next was even more unsettling. Quote, "There's something going on," they recall him saying, "and I don't know what it is," end of quotes. It turned out that Lori Beatty was just one of many local residents who had gone to Marrero's office exhibiting similar inexplicable symptoms of neurological decline. More than 20 in the previous 4 years. 20 patients in the past 4 years. That's significant. The first signs were often behavioral. One patient fell asleep for nearly 20 hours straight before a friend took her to the hospital. Another found himself afraid to disturb the stranger who had sat down in his living room, only to realize hours later the stranger was his wife. But these anxieties and sleep problems quickly gave way to more acute presentations: limb pain, trouble balancing, teeth chattering, and shock-like muscle spasms so violent that some patients could no longer sleep in the same bed as their spouses. Many patients developed vision problems. Some experienced terrifying hallucinations like daydreaming, Marrero says, but a nightmare. As the sickness continued to manifest, muscles wasted away and cognitive decline set in. Some patients died, others plateaued in various states of distress. In each case, Marrero struggled to determine the definitive diagnosis. The symptoms belonged to a broad spectrum of neurological disorders, but there were always something starkly atypical about the patient's presentation. Their decline was too swift, or not swift enough. They lacked key indicators of a particular disease, or they failed to respond to known therapies, a hallmark of how neurologists diagnose conditions. Even more alarming, many of the patients were unusually young. Nearly half were middle-aged, and a few were in their 20s and 30s. At a presentation to a panel of experts at the University of British Columbia, Marrero recalled crying out for help, as he put it. "What else can I do in terms of testing? What am I missing?" The Beattys say Marrero explained that he had other patients in similar situations, but because of confidentiality laws, he couldn't say more. Quote, "We were scared to death," Tim told me. He and Jill wondered whether some overlooked genetic factor might put them at risk for the same fate as their dad. Because many of the symptoms resembled that of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, Marrero had been reporting each case to the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease surveillance system, a federal monitoring program within the Public Health Agency of Canada, and as his referrals began to pile up, scientists at the agency had started to take notice. 6 months after Marrero revealed his concerns to the Beattys, a working group of experts was convened to investigate. By then, Marrero had come to believe that his patients were suffering from a previously undescribed illness. Quote, "When you have not seen something," end of quotes, he later told a reporter, quote, "it is very likely that we have not learned to see it." His federal colleagues were inclined to agree. According to the PHAC scientists, both the number of undiagnosed patients and, more importantly, their ages were unprecedented at the national and provincial levels. They called it the New New Brunswick neurological syndrome of unknown etiology. In March 2021, when a memo alerting local doctors to the existence of the mysterious disease leaked to the press, the news made headlines around the world. Morero's patients and their families hoped that an explanation for their suffering would soon be revealed. 3 years later, however, no satisfactory explanation has been found, and the New Brunswick system remains shrouded in mystery. This article just came out August 14th. At the heart of the matter in the question is whether something in the environment may be responsible, at least in part, for the onset of the patient's illness. It's a question that underscores not only the tangled relationship between public health and patient rights, but also the inherently confounding nature of neurological conditions. In the absence of answers, what began as a puzzling medical mystery has been transformed into a situation rife with suspicion. Accusations and nefarious plots to silence doctors, scientists, leaking internal documents, and growing community of patients and advocates intent on proving the government's hand in a cover-up. Friends, I'm telling you, pay attention. We don't have tinfoil hats, Tim Beatty said of the provincial government last year, but if you're looking to breed a group of people to believe in a conspiracy theory, they have done a fantastic job. Neurodegenerative diseases are among the leading causes of death and disability worldwide, yet their origins remain mysterious. We don't know what triggers them in some people or others, or exactly how they interplay with various risk factors. Genetics clearly play a role, as do aging and lifestyle considerations like smoking and heavy drinking. But genetics alone account for only a small percentage of the cases in brain disorders, Alzheimer's diseases, Parkinson's disease, etc., or even ALS. The remaining cases appear to be a product of a complex interplay of genetic predisposition and environmental factors, including exposure to toxic substances, which a growing number of researchers believe may be responsible for triggering the onset of degeneration. The precise mechanisms behind that triggering, however, remain stubbornly elusive. This is partly down to the newness of the science. It was only in the 1980s that the first tangible evidence connecting a toxicant with a neurodegeneration came to light in a tragic experiment of nature. A group of drug users in California accidentally injected themselves with a bad batch of designer heroin and began suffering from symptoms closely resembling Parkinson's disease. Investigators traced the batch to a back alley chemist who has synthesized the drugs and found he had mistakenly created a neurotoxin precursor known as MPTP as part of the concoction. Despite the growing consensus, the link remains diabolically difficult to prove. After all, it's not ethical to feed people toxic substances. Even when the surrounding variables are so complex and numerous, and proving a definitive connection is nearly impossible. In New Brunswick, the evidence for a shared environmental contaminant was strong. The patients were grouped in two primary locations, in Moncton area and the Acadian Peninsula, a francophone region home to picturesque fishing villages and blueberry farms, along with New Brunswick northeast coast. Investigators wondered whether a common source of food or water might be to explain the geographic clustering. There were also a number of households with multiple patients who were not genetically linked, husbands and wives, stepfathers and stepdaughters, a nursing student and her ward. Those close contact cases were difficult to explain outside of a common exposure. The hard part was figuring out what the exposure might be. During weekly meetings in the spring of 2021, Morero and his colleagues consulted experts in zoonotic disease, water science, and pathology in an effort to whittle down a long list of hazardous environmental agents to a select few worth targeting in their research. The goal was a full-scale epidemiological study, boots on the ground as one senior scientist put it, including interviews, diagnostic tests, and environmental and tissue sampling. Many of the scientists saw the situation as a rare opportunity. If this potential cluster of patients really was being caused by a toxic substance, it would offer a rare chance to study the toxin-brain relationship in real time. This is exactly the way a true research project should proceed. As you're going to see, things are not always what they seem to be. Initially, government support for the study was robust. At a briefing in April 2021, Dr. Theresa Tam, the country's chief public health officer, advised the working group to engage the widest expert network possible and ensured that the investigation wouldn't be tied up in bureaucracy, as every government investigation is. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research offered the province $5 million to help fund a 2-year clinical investigation. But then something changed. A month later, on the afternoon of May 6, 2021, an email from the provincial health department began to circulate saying that all currently scheduled meetings would be paused until provincial researchers, quote, had the time to delve more deeply into existing data, end of quotes. Meetings that had been planned months in advance were wiped from the calendar. Field experts and neurologists were left waiting on Zoom links that never came. There was a stop, suddenly, abruptly, with no apparent explanation, says Marrero, who called the decision, quote, unusual by any standards. Things grew even more murky 10 days later, when Marrero says he got a call on his cell phone from Dr. Hanan Smati, the province's leading epidemiologist, telling him to stop reporting potential new cases to the provincial authorities. What? Marrero was appalled. The number of patients in the cluster at the time, 48, 8 were dead, was counting to rise. According to Marrero, when he asked where the request was coming from, Smati told him, quote, it comes from higher up. The province also sent a note to the federal authorities asking them to take a step back from public communications because of heightened sensitivities in New Brunswick, a request that one senior scientist told a reporter from a Canadian magazine was tantamount to being muzzled. Public Health New Brunswick says that Smati never reached out to Marrero and told him to stop reporting cases. The agency declined to make its employees, including Smati, available for comment. Yeah, sorry, I believe Smati. Provincial officials would later claim that the reason for pausing the federal working group's involvement was largely jurisdictional. Because the patients in the cluster were from New Brunswick, it was the province's responsibility to lead an investigation. And a few weeks later, Dorothy Shepherd, New Brunswick health minister at the time, announced a province-run surveillance study to examine potential dietary and geographic links in the cluster members, as well as an oversight committee that included 6 neurologists to independently investigate the unknown illness. The new committee would, as an announcement put it, quote, provide expert second opinions, end quote, and, quote, rule out potential causes. Unaware at the time that the federal scientists had been sidelined, patients and their advocates celebrated the news. Internal emails from the period, however, call the province's rationale into question. They appear to show New Brunswick officials strategizing to keep the investigation from spreading to the federal level. In one example, Smati notes that 2 cluster patients who had moved out of the province should not be interviewed specifically because their inclusion would make the effort multi-jurisdictional. So what? Oh my gosh. Suspicions also quickly surfaced about the objectives of the study Shepherd had promised. A few days after the announcement, Kat Langentine, a New Brunswick native and a founder of Bloodwatch, a nonprofit that promotes a safe blood system in Canada, received a cryptic text on her cell phone from an anonymous source claiming that the province was not taking its investigation seriously. She began asking around among sources in both provincial and federal governments and was disturbed by what she learned. Rather than implementing the boots-on-the-ground approach recommended by the feds, it appeared that New Brunswick officials had decided instead to relitigate the work's original findings, namely whether a cluster of patients existed at all. They apparently were not even trying to investigate the possibility of a toxin. Not one single environmental sample had left the province, the Tang said. Not water, not food. If the oversight committee concluded that the patients weren't linked by a common condition, then there was little point in the strapped public department trying to find one. I think they've pulled the plug on the wall and nobody knows. She reached out to Steve Ellis, who started a Facebook group for patients, family members, after his own father, Roger, was referred to Marrero, and told him what she had learned. Do you want to fight back, she asked. Before long, Ellis amassed a cohort of patients and family members who shared deep misgivings about the province's methods. For one, the investigation was happening almost entirely in secret. Not only was Marrero kept at a distance, ostensibly so that he wouldn't bias the work of the Oversight Committee neurologists, but so were the patients. We had no idea what was going on, says Stacy Quigley, whose daughter Gabrielle Cormier was the youngest confirmed case in the cluster. There was just crickets on all ends. The patients had invested much hope in the possibility of an answer that the silence became maddening. Gabrielle, then only 20 years old, struggling to walk without the help of a cane, asked to be checked into a hospital for psychiatric support while her family waited to hear the public officials in charge. I'd be going crazy if I was a parent. In October 2021, news arrived that further complicated the case. Dr. Gerard Jansen, the neurologist in charge of autopsies for the 8 of the patients, had published a shocking conclusion. All 8 patients died not from a mysterious illness, but from known diseases, including cancer, Lewy body dementia, and Alzheimer's. Tim Beatty was driving to work when he heard on that radio that the autopsy results had been made public. Quote, "I can literally point on the road where I was," he says, "because I almost drove off." As it turned out, Jansen had stopped believing in the cluster months before the autopsies leaked. In an email to colleagues in that May, he offered what's known in the world of public health as a null hypothesis. The premise that there is no relationship between the findings until overwhelming evidence proves otherwise. Jansen hadn't seen any signs of uniform pathology in the brains of patients during the autopsies and was wary of the various theories put forward by the group. Quote, "The available evidence," he wrote, "actually suggests directly that this cluster does not exist." Oh, man. When I read this, I thought, this is pure insanity. This is the government trying to make something disappear. When I asked Marrero about the autopsy results, he told me he was taken aback by the authority with which Jansen presented them. Quote, "Causality is not for the pathologist to establish," he said. Marrero didn't doubt that Jansen had found evidence of numerous diseases, but that didn't exclude the possibility that those diseases might have been triggered by something in the environment. People exposed to heavy metals sometimes develop Parkinson's syndrome, sometimes develop cancer, sometimes neuropathy, but it's still exposure to heavy metals. In the context of a cluster of atypical cases that had stumped some of the most experienced scientists in Canada, Marrero believed that Jansen had not only overstepped his bounds, but had failed to address the situation's most critical questions. Why so many young? Why so many in one area? Why so many in one family? Many of Marrero's colleagues in the working group agreed. In a leaked email from last year's, one of them referred to Jansen's findings as a, quote, "loophole through which the politicians have eagerly leaped to conclude nothing coherent is going on here." For patients and their advocates, the release of Jansen's findings was a turning point. That's when we said, okay, gloves are off. Elisa's Facebook group became a clearinghouse for ideas about how to counter the official narrative. There was a talk of a patient's crowdfunding, environmental testing themselves, and inviting Aaron Brockovich to do an outside investigation. Ellis began appearing on podcasts, on TV, but the patient's efforts left them no closer to answering the questions. Why had the province declined the help of the federal experts? And considering the ambiguity of the science, why weren't they also testing for toxic substances? In lieu of satisfactory responses from officials, theories of all kinds began to circulate, from bureaucratic incompetence to conspiracies blaming the influence on malevolent corporate interests. Marrero's position was perhaps the most popular. Quote, "I think that what created the scare was the word environment," end of quotes. He told me last summer he believes that in the spring of 2021, as a tangible plan for testing, New Brunswick's air, soil, and water began to materialize. The province got cold feet. Forestry, tourism, and seafood are among the region's most prominent, profitable industries, all of which rely on a healthy environment to survive. While Marrero's theory was pure speculation, a number of experts involved in the working group also came to believe that political forces had eclipsed the scientific one. Citing concerns over how their statements might affect their access to public funding, those experts declined to speak on the record, but one sentiment appeared ubiquitous among the group. By limiting the investigation at the onset, provincial officials had squandered a rare opportunity for advancing the kind of broad scientific spectrum study they needed. Over time, nerves began to fray. During our investigation, he told me gravely about an incident a few years ago when he was followed by a man in a blue car as he drove home from his television interview. Yeah, this is getting a little scary. He asked the show's producer to come down. When she appeared, the other car sped away. I could have had an accident, he said, but no one's knowing. On February 24th, 2022, Russell announced that the Oversight Committee had finished its work. The survey, she said, could find no common exposure in the group. It was the same conclusion that Janssen, their neuropathologist, reached. In their final report, provincial health officials explained that they believe what had gone wrong. They argued that the case definition for illness was overly broad to the point that it overlapped with the conditions. Because of that, no human tissue testing was needed. They also singled out Marrero for not seeking second opinions before referring patients to the cluster, an assertion he rejects. He notes that in 2021, the working group had offered second opinions on a number of cases, going so far as to remove a few from the cluster. Marrero says he also spent countless hours discussing the situation with Dr. Neil Cashman, one of Canada's foremost neurologists. And Cashman later agreed to go to New Brunswick to meet the patients face-to-face. In recently leaked emails, Marrero's federal colleagues also appeared to reject the province's findings. It seems that the best interests of those affected have not been in the forefront of the actions taken, wrote Dr. Samuel Weiss, a neuroscientist working for the federal agency that offered the $5 million to fund it. How this continues to be the case is part of a larger mystery around the intentions of the government's focus on politics, power, and process over the humanity of care. Dr. Michael Couthart, head of the federal surveillance system for Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, was even more direct. Quote, "My scientific opinion is that there is something real going on in New Brunswick that absolutely cannot be explained by the bias or agenda of an individual neurologist," he wrote in an email to colleagues. He too felt that the decline in Marrero's patients was most likely caused by an environmental trigger. Quote, "I believe the truth will assert itself in time," he concluded. For the patients, the government's report was a devastating blow. Before its release, they began receiving letters from provincial health officials detailing different diagnoses for their physicians to consider. Gabrielle Cormier was told she might have schizophrenic. Ellis was told his father might have progressive supranucleus palsy. The committee hadn't seen either patient in person. It based its second opinions on medical charts alone. One cluster members were provided with possible diagnosis of cancer, alcohol-induced brain damage, HIV, and a broad range of dementias, all of which were dismissed by testing years later. The province has maintained that its investigation was scientifically sound, and the Public Agency of Canada supported the results, but implicit in its vision of events was a sobering concession. According to provincial officials, the patients were suffering not from an unknown illness, but from incurable diseases that are known all too well, and they were doing so at rates, especially young among people, that were shockingly high. Last year I met with Marrero at a hotel in Moncton overlooking the Trans-Canadian Highway. He was dressed in a finely tailored gray suit and introduced himself warmly. As he rode in the elevator to my room, however, it became clear that the dark suspicions had yet to abate. Before our meeting, he refused to speak with me over the phone and was hesitant to talk at the hotel conference room. He hadn't spoken to the press in 18 months. "If I was thinking strictly in terms of me as an individual and as a physician, it's better I don't talk," he said. His lawyer had advised against it. Marrero, however, felt duty-bound. "I have to provide answers to people who are sick," he said, "and I do everything I can for them." Marrero told me that since the province concluded its investigation, things had gotten worse. The number of undiagnosed patients currently under his care had risen to 430. 111 whom were under the age of 45, 39 had died. By Marrero's accounting, New Brunswick is now the center of one of the most prolific young-onset dementia centers in the world. Nobody who was involved in this can pretend they didn't know, he said. There have been clinical developments as well. In December 2022, Marrero found a toxicology lab in Quebec that was willing to test patients for 4 different types of pesticides, including glyphosate, a herbicide that is regularly used as part of a forestry industry in New Brunswick. He had noticed a pattern of new referrals peaking in late summer and early fall when pesticide use was at the highest, and wondered if there could be a connection. When the lab accepted a sample from one patient, Marrero quickly sent over 100 more. The results were astonishing. 90% of Morero's patients came back with elevated amounts of glyphosate in their blood. In one case, as high as 15,000 times the test's lowest detectable concentration. Whoa! On their own, the results mean little. Without a control group, it's impossible to understand the context. Perhaps everyone in New Brunswick has elevated levels because of spraying in the province. They don't know. Part of the reason Morero was able to get the test done in Quebec was that in 2021, the province officially recognized the link between glyphosate and an increased risk for Parkinson's disease. Morero's conviction notwithstanding, the fact remains the situation in New Brunswick has raised far more questions than answers. Was the epidemiological study blocked by political or corporate interests, as Morero told me he suspected? Or was he an overzealous physician who had rushed to stamp his name on a novel disease, as the province's report implied? And of course, the answer to the more fundamental question of all, what exactly is making New Brunswick ill, remains elusive. What does seem clear, however, is that the collision of politics and science unfolding there is unlikely to remain elusive to the province. As the evidence-leaking neurological disorders and environmental factors continues to grow, the way in which diseases manifest in the human body will undoubtedly be altered as well. It's not difficult to imagine the next puzzling disease cluster right around the corner. It's a concern that keeps Morero up at night. This is a collective effort that's needed, he said, not only for the people of New Brunswick, but because whatever is causing this might be happening elsewhere. He has already received referrals from half a dozen other Canadian provinces. When I asked how he thought the situation would play out over the long term, he was uncertain. I don't pretend to have the answer, he said. I think science should be the answer. Now, why did I read you that? Because here in the USA, our military has done this to our soldiers. They had burn pits at various military bases. They had one at Area 51. And they burned some of the worst chemicals imaginable. They caused soldiers to get diseases. And they fought for decades to finally get the VA to acknowledge it. Finally. Not quite as mysterious as this, because everyone kind of knew. But there have been times in the past in the US that our own government has sprayed things on citizens to later test the results on how it affected different people. Yes, we've done that to our own people. And again, I give that to you because this may not be isolated to just New Brunswick. It may be happening in your area as well. We just don't know. Because this thing was in the New York Times, but I didn't see it get a lot of play. I want you to pay attention to that. All right, the missing persons case involves a man named A.H. Smith, 60 years old. He was a hunter in California. From June to October, we have the most people missing in the woods. Why would that be? Think about it as a common sense question. It's easy because that's summer months. Families go on vacation, kids are out of school. It's the nicest months to go into the forest. And then September and October have the biggest concentration because that's when hunters go into the woods. Hunters go off trail. Most hikers stay on trail. Well, hunters go off. Well, A.H. lived in a city called Galt, California, south of Sacramento. And he worked for a company called the Sego, S-E-G-O Milk Company in Galt. He was an extremely seasoned hunter. He had gone to this exact area many, many times. He was with a friend called V.B. Skiff. And they were hunting in an area southeast of Kybers near China Flat. Gone many times to hunt deer there. Skiff was from Lathrop, California. They had hunted together many times. They were good friends. Now, this is Highway 50. This goes from Sacramento, ends up in South Lake Tahoe. I've traveled this road hundreds of times. My folks used to have a place in South Lake Tahoe. This is the El Dorado National Forest. This is China Flat. Elevation in this area, it can get pretty high, 6, 7, 8,000 feet in some areas. But there's a lot of water in this area, and there's a lot of granite. Well, specifically, the two hunters were in an area called Mule Canyon. They'd always had a lot of good hunting success there. On September 17th, Smith and Skiff were exiting their hunting camp, and they decided to split up and hunt. Point of separation. They decided to come back before dark. Well, that night, Smith didn't come back. Skiff said that he knew he could handle himself in the woods. He had no worries about it. But as it got later and later, he kept the fire going, stayed up as late as he could, fell asleep. Early the next morning, Smith had not returned to camp, and Skiff took the car and went to the local ranger station for the U.S. Forest Service and reported his hunting partner as missing. They were able to gather 3 rangers from the office and immediately went back to camp, went into the woods. Before they left their office, they made a request for more rangers just in case something went wrong. Well, they searched that night till about 8 o'clock, and it was getting dark. They didn't find anything. And they weren't sure exactly where in Mule Canyon he was going. September 19th, 10 rangers from throughout the district arrived at the ranger station, and they went back into the woods looking, trying to see what they could find. They had also made a call back to Galt, to his family, spread the word out that he was missing. The rangers decided that they were going to search in a grid pattern up outside of the hunting zone so that they wouldn't miss an area. Well, again, they came back late that night, exhausted, didn't find anything, saw other hunters, told them what they were looking for. And the second full day of the search, September 20th, 15 rangers were able to be used. They found nothing. They came back to camp, and Skiff was just blindsided. They said, well, we're going to terminate the search. We didn't find anything. He's not in there. A completely insane maneuver. Why? Because Smith was in really good shape for 60 years old. Knew the area. He didn't get lost. Most probably he was out there with a broken leg, something where he couldn't communicate or couldn't move. Under those circumstances, you think, well, if he was near water, how long could he survive? 7, 10, 12, 14 days? So at the end of 2.5 days, you're just going to quit? It was insane. Well, the Seago Milk Company in Galt heard about this, and they were irate. They decided to get 15 of their employees, along with the assistant plant manager, a guy named Robert Reed, and they immediately drove up to the site. Reed was in charge of getting the food and water for the searchers and the employees, and immediately the next morning they started to search. Forest Service committed one person to help them organize, tell them where they were going, etc. And on one of those first days, they found a hat. And the Forest Service came out and made a press statement that, oh yeah, we showed this hat to Mrs. Smith, and she confirmed that it's her husband, so we're going to put all of our resources into that area. Mrs. Smith, at home, hears the story and says, that's craziness. Nobody showed me a hat. So people at the plant go up there and tell him, hey, that hat had nothing to do with Mr. Smith. I don't know why you said that. And Mrs. Smith said, no, it had nothing to do with him, and nobody ever showed it to me. So they went back to searching the entire Mule Canyon and things even outside of the perimeter. Mrs. Smith told the press that her husband would never get lost there, ever. He hunted there dozens of times. He was in good health. He could hike miles. September 25th, the U.S. Forest Service holds a press conference and says that they didn't believe that Mr. Smith was even hunting in the area of China Flat because they found nothing to indicate he was there. And their association with the search was over. What? What? This reminded me of the frustration level that some search and rescue people have when they don't find anything. They think people are lying, or I'm not sure. They didn't call anybody a liar, but they said he wasn't hunting there. But Skip said he was, and their camp was there. And that really lays the foundation for a missing 411 case. No tracks, didn't find a rifle, no body. Well, in this area there was granite, there was water. He was a hunter, a subgroup of the missing. He had point of separation, and he had no tracks. And oddly enough, Smith was never found. And like his wife said, he would never get lost there. The behavior of the Forest Service on this case doesn't even match the behavior I've seen in the past. They're always very readily there to help. Very, very frustrating. One of the few cases where I've seen outlandish behavior by the Forest Service. One of the few times. So that's your case for today. A.H. Smith, 60 years old, missing September 17th, 1950. Never found in an area I've been in many times. Thanks for being here. Be kind to people. Be kind to your neighbor. Be kind to your help at the store, clerks, baggers. Doesn't hurt. Smile. Be cordial. This is the kindness revolution, and we are going to be kind to people. It costs us nothing. Please make sure you're still subscribed. If you are not subscribed, tell me. And you can buy our books. Don't buy our books on Amazon, eBay, Etsy, because you'll get ripped off by resellers. We only sell on our site $25 a piece. NA, like North America, NABigfootsearch.com. Watch our movies. 3 documentaries, all on Tubi. Missing 411, Missing 411 The Hunted, Missing 411 The UFO Connection. Free to watch. Please watch. Have a great day. Paulides out.